From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud, a senior fellow at MEI and the director of the Climate and Water Program. The effects of climate change have been particularly adverse this year in the MENA region. We've seen prolonged droughts continue to diminish freshwater supplies, a higher frequency of dust storms, devastating floods, and a crippling heat wave during this summer season. With Egypt hosting the upcoming COP27 meeting, followed by COP28 in the United Arab Emirates next year, current and future challenges associated with climate change need to be addressed by prioritizing near-term strategies and approaches. To that end, and on today's program, we asked several of MEI's Climate and Water Program scholars what they consider to be the most pressing priorities and concerns regarding climate change, water resources, and the environment in the next few upcoming years. We'll start with Andrei Covatariu, who discusses an area most closely associated with the current state of climate change, both in terms of cause and mitigation, and that is the global energy sector.
I guess that apart from general challenges and concerns that we always had on climate change, such as the slow pace of phasing out fossil fuels, unfair allocation of resources to regions facing adaptation issues, or scaling up renewable generators, this year we have a few specific concerns coming from the energy sector. First, as Europe is facing real energy security challenges, some countries have prolonged coal utilization for electricity generators and even invested in infrastructure for LNG imports. And while this is needed to face the current energy supply shortages, as well as to keep prices low and implicitly offset any extremist messages in European parliaments, this could also be a concern. As we know, governments in general are not very agile in adjusting their policies, so prolonging coal and investing in gas could translate into delayed progress on the renewables front. But at the same time, the solidarity that is developing, at least to some extent, at EU level, has the potential to scale up renewables much faster in the years to come, as long as we are not caught in this fossil fuels trap. Second, I'm deeply concerned about the availability of critical minerals, including rare earth metals, which are vital for the energy transition process. Their prices have surged over the past months and years, mainly because of the global economies restarting their activities and the demand rising exponentially. But as we all know, the extraction of these metals, and even more so the refining of these minerals, are controlled by China, and this is a real challenge for a fast-paced energy transition. This in itself is a geopolitical issue, but if we also consider the relatively close relation between the Russian Federation and China, we have additional reasons to be concerned. In this context, deploying renewable capacities and energy assets in general will cost us more now. Moreover, as energy is expensive anywhere nowadays and manufacturing components for wind or solar power plants is an energy-intensive activity, we have another reason for bullish prices. I would also add one more concern, the third one, because for the past few weeks I've heard the same challenges from colleagues working in Asia, in Africa, in North America, or in Europe. Despite the increased number of funds allocated for sustainable projects in general, there is still a lack of capacity of writing projects and absorbing this money. While I'm not concerned about this on the medium and long term, because the demand for writing and deploying projects will push professionals to grab this opportunity, I'm concerned about it on the short run. Because as we all know, the window of opportunity to address climate change issues is very narrow, and any delays in deploying these solutions could lead to irreversible negative effects.
Next, Athraa Khamis provides us a broader view on the long-term implications of drought.
I believe that the most pressing concern about climate change is drought, which is embedded in lack of precipitation and water depletion. Water is essential to all life on Earth. Both its availability or lack of it could be either a driver or inhibitor to life continuity and development on Earth. And we know that approximately 70% of Earth's surface is water, but fresh water accounts for less than 3% of it and is mostly unavailable, stored and locked in the polar ice sheets or deep underground. The fresh water that can be easily used by human beings is, let's say, it's less than 1% of the total water on Earth. Since the 20th century, there has been a serious shortage of water resources globally, and it has been worsened by the influence of global decrease of rain, rapidly growing population, and the fast developing economies. Drought can last for months or years, with agriculture and food security often being the most severely affected. Now, drought and water scarcity aggravate poverty and adversely affect economic growth, health and well-being, gender equality in a way, and the environment, of course. And we have actually seen that in 2007 with the drought crisis, where we had very hot and dry weather, groundwater depletion as a result of lack of rain, forest fires, and crop damage, leading to food insecurity. We have seen health problems as drinking water has been widely scarce, especially in the Middle Eastern countries. Drought actually knows no national boundaries and affect all socio-economic sector of societies. In these situations of water insecurity and uneven water resources distribution, as a consequence, unsustainable agriculture and crop production, drought could act as a huge contributor to unrest, political environments, conflicts, and even wars. The period between 2007 and 2010, which was called the worst drought in the instrumental record, have witnessed of mass migration of farming families to the urban centers and conflicts between and within countries. Now, suggesting that the limited groundwater reserves will play an increasingly important role in meeting future water needs, preserving the depletion of it is extremely challenging, especially with the dynamic conditions of both climate change and nation development. So people find ways to compensate for the water shortage largely by extracting groundwater. Now, we have frequent pumping of water from ground. However, groundwater is a non-renewable resource in many places, and we tend to pump water more quickly than it can renew itself, leading to a dangerous shortage in groundwater supply as well, limiting biodiversity, large bodies of water becoming more shallow from groundwater depletion. Today, we have critical water stress already affected around 10% of the global population. That dimension of water stress, unfortunately, stretch and expand geographically. So water resources are the highest necessity of the survival of all human beings, animals, and other living creatures as well. And water resources are the most important foundation for social and economic development. Not only that, but a lot of climate change concerns and other issues are actually falling under the umbrella of water scarcity and drought, threaten food production, frequent wildfires, as we explained earlier, extreme weather in both summer and winter, and the transition between them, fall and spring, almost disappearing, which again affect crops production. Drought also contribute an increasing event of dust and sandstorms, increasing residency of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the list could actually go on. So, water is basically life, and without it, most, if not all life aspects fall apart.
Diving a little bit deeper on the issue of water resources availability, Malak Altaeb discusses the link between climate change and water resources scarcity in the MENA region.
In terms of pressing priorities or even concerns when discussing either climate change or even environmental challenges, especially for the MENA region, it's important to note that climate change is directly linked with the environmental challenges available in the region. And unfortunately, climate change is a present tense issue that must be tackled now and must no longer be addressed in the past tense. For the MENA region, the impact of climate change is amplified with poor governance over natural resources, which is making the adaptation with climate change a little difficult for so many reasons. But if I am to choose a pressing priority in the next few years, I would highlight water resources. For example, especially in terms of the availability and accessibility. Given that due to the unequal distribution of water resources worldwide and also the high rate of water scarcity registered in the MENA region, the impact of climate change, especially on the available water resources, made those resources under huge demand. This will highly likely reflect, for instance, on food security in a negative sense, especially that many countries within the region depend on the sector, while others are still dependent on food imports. The increasing scarcity of water is directly linked to the viability of agriculture, which will change in the next few years the structure of agriculture across the region. Thus, it's important to understand that the accessibility and availability of water resources will be in huge question. Also, in terms of quality, even if water is available, to what extent that water will be of good use to many communities. Therefore, it's essential to understand that connecting water and food insecurities and their impacts on rural communities will be of question, and the kind of practices, especially in terms of farming techniques and practices by these communities, and how that will reflect overall within the region. Thus, it's important to keep water management and government under the focus, but also the necessity to stress on how early adaptation can support many communities within the MENA region to adapt with this water scarcity, but also support water availability, quality, and also accessibility through sound management and governance techniques.
Without water security, local food production becomes vulnerable. Megan Ferrando explores how climate change is contributing to food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa.
So I would put emphasis on the links between climate change and food insecurity, meaning not having reliable access to sufficient and affordable food. If we look specifically at the Middle East and North Africa region, we have, as we know, a region that's particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts because it naturally faces very high temperatures, has scarce water resources, and only 5% of its land surface can be used to grow food. That already makes food production tricky for the region, because for food production, you need sufficient fertile land and enough water. And climate change is already worsening this. So, for example, we already see more extended and intense heat waves and fires. This summer, Tunisia's grain harvest was badly affected by fires and heat, just a year that the country had decided to rely less on grain imports because of the high import prices. We also see the drying out of rivers and of underground aquifers, together with the decrease in precipitation in what's actually already the most water-scarce region in the world. And this, while countries use the vast majority of their water resources for agriculture. We also expect to see in the coming decades an increase in sea level rise, which means that seawater can intrude coastal aquifers and wells, since many agricultural hubs in countries like, for example, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, are situated along the coast. This will increase the salinity levels of the land and destroy agricultural production. And I think in general, we can say that climate change is leading to an increase in extreme weather events like dust storms, fires, flood, etc. All of these climate-induced events, they devastate agricultural land. They reduce the yields of crops, and they contribute to price hikes and income losses. And this is happening in a context where there is a continuously increasing demand for food, as the population in the region keeps on growing quite fast, actually. And the availability of food and water resources is already not keeping up. So, as climate change further complicates food production at home, MENA countries are increasingly going to have to rely on food imports. Now, it's important to realize that a lot of countries in the region are already heavily dependent on imports. Around 50% of the food consumed in the region is imported. Unfortunately, as the war in Ukraine has shown, for example, being highly dependent on imports means that you're also very much exposed to international disruptions in food supplies and prices. So, if there are disruptions in international markets and you don't have sufficient domestic production at home to fall back on, this causes huge problems. Countries like Egypt, Lebanon, Yemen, Tunisia are experiencing this right now, as over half of the wheat they consume comes from Ukraine or Russia, and the price of important commodities like sunflower oil has soared. On the other hand, some countries that have enough budgetary resources are generally able to absorb the cost of more and more expensive food imports, as is the case with the Gulf countries. So why am I saying that it's important to keep food security on the radar? I'd say two main important reasons. First being that food insecurity disproportionately affects poorer segments of the population and really accentuates inequalities. People with lower incomes have less of a financial safety net to absorb shocks. So when climate change affects crops, leads to price rises and food scarcity, people who are already more vulnerable are even less able to cope and protect themselves from the effects of climate change. It's even a double-edged sword for farmers. As climate change affects the crops that they grow, this doesn't only affect their food security, but also their jobs. And I'd say the second reason why it's important to focus on food security is, well, it's not a universal truth. We can draw some careful links between food insecurity and social instability. Some of the sparks that ignited public outcry during the Arab uprisings in the early 2010s in Egypt and Tunisia were directly linked to food inflation. And the recent inflation in food commodities caused by the war in Ukraine have already brought people to the streets in countries across the MENA region. So we can say that food insecurity can be a threat to social stability, to people's financial stability, but also to combating climate change itself. Because when more pressing social, political, or economic issues come on the table, climate and environment are automatically pushed down the agenda, even if it is very important to work on them right now to avoid bigger problems down the road. In Lebanon right now, there is an enormous financial crisis, there's a food crisis, a fuel crisis, a job crisis. It makes sense that nobody wants to discuss sustainability and climate action, even if we should actually really be discussing this, because droughts and decreased water levels are going to pose a big problem for farmers in the near future. The problems now are getting in the way of addressing problems down the road. But the complicated part in everything I've mentioned is that you can never say that food insecurity is only caused by climate change. It's always a combination of factors. The food insecurity in the MENA region has risen sharply because of the economic fallout of COVID-19. And if we look at some of the most food insecure countries in the MENA region, is by far those who are in conflict, like Yemen, where over 80% of the population is food insecure, and Syria, where 60% is food insecure. So ensuring food security and working on mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change in general also means working on political, economic, and social issues. It's not something that you can work on in silo. Many of the countries in the MENA region are already facing enough issues as is. So I would say it's a good entry point to focus on addressing food insecurity, to ensure that issues around food and the social and political implications that come with it don't add yet another layer of complications to already tricky contexts.
Looking more broadly at implementing climate solutions, Youssef Wehbe gives us insight on how to better leverage climate-related financing and cutting-edge research to target more expansive and non-conventional solutions.
With COP27 happening right around the corner, in this brief segment I'd like to touch on its high-level themes of climate finance, technology, and innovation. COP26 in Glasgow ended last November with a historic commitment by richer nations to provide low and middle-income countries with around $40 billion annually in quote-unquote adaptation finance from 2025 onwards. The adaptation funds are intended to help communities to protect themselves against the impacts of climate change, such as loss of life, destruction of homes, and farmland. The COP26 achievement was hard-won. Although it builds on a $100 billion annual climate finance commitment made at COP15 in Copenhagen back in 2009, most of this finance, around $83 billion in total, comes in the form of loans for mitigation projects to help stave off the worst impacts of climate change. And what I mean by that is, for example, by installing solar panels or wind farms to reduce fossil fuel use. So basically projects from which funders can expect a return. In contrast, adaptation schemes such as strengthening flood defenses or providing sunlight-reflecting cool roofs for households are better done by the public sector. This is why adaptation finance needs to be better offered in the form of grants. However, grants, on the other hand, are expectedly harder to fund and are less attractive to funding nations compared to the loan model, which returns a profit for these lending nations. Moving back to 2010 in COP16, the parties established the Standing Committee on Finance, the SEF, to assist the COP in exercising its functions in relation to the financial mechanism of the convention. So basically improving the coherence and coordination in the delivery of climate change financing, rationalizing the overall financial mechanism, and mobilization of financial resources and measurement, along with the reporting and verification, of course, to the developing countries among the parties. So looking at some of the reports released by this SEF, I've looked through these SEF reports, and what I've found is that funding primarily goes to adaptation and mitigation projects. But what about blue sky science, research and development, and innovation with technology readiness level considerations? We really need to start thinking beyond conventional approaches of forestation, constructed wetlands, and wastewater treatment technology, to name a few of the conventional approaches. Now, moving on, a few weeks ago, just here in Dubai, there was the annual Water, Energy, Technology, and Environment exhibition, WETEX, which showcased a broad range of water technologies that are specifically tailored to this hyper-arid region and climate change hotspot of the world. Some of the exhibited solutions included data-driven solar-powered atmospheric water generators, as well as broad as weather modification technologies such as cloud seeding and novel bio-geoengineering applications. What I've seen is that there's so much potential to scale up these innovations and integrate them at the community and national scale in developing arid countries, given that grant funding is made available. In the US and most EU national research administrations like the National Science Foundation, for example, they all have limited pathways to grant research funding to foreign organizations. So in essence, applied research and technology solutions that work for the US socioeconomic, geographic, and infrastructure considerations may not be directly operable in developing countries and arid regions of the world. That said, we might need more globally oriented research programs targeting climate change to solicit ideas from the international scientific community. The problem is extremely multidisciplinary, and we need the climate research spectrum to catch up and leverage the big leaps that have been made in other research areas, such as advanced materials, artificial intelligence, unmanned systems, and observational platforms.
Finally, we go to Orestes Morfin, who shares with us an ongoing overall concern when it comes to addressing the climate crisis, the dangers of disinformation.
In my opinion, the most pressing priority or concern regarding climate change, water resources, or the environment in the next few years is disinformation. I note the convergence of 4 factors visibly at work in the world today. First, a general lack of agreement on a mutually beneficial future for the planet. Second, a resistance against scientific evidence and disdain for facts. Third, weaponization of language and social media by special interests. Fourth, undermining and lack of faith in the institutions responsible for legislating, implementing, and regulating the measures necessary to mitigate climate change in crucial circles. The problem is not a lack of technical capacity or evidence. The problem is a lack of will. Disinformation is the common currency to all of these. Conditions favorable to human life are favorable to all human life, regardless of origin or socioeconomic standing. The factors contributing to their degradation are a matter of scientific and public record. Why, then, is there persistent reluctance to adopt, or in some cases even consider, measures to mitigate or help reverse their advancement? The answer, unfortunately, lies in the attractiveness of short-term monetary or political gain. Whatever the motive, the end result is an inability to reach global consensus as to what constitutes a mutually beneficial future for life on Earth. For those parties with an interest in denying the existence of or the mechanisms causing climate change, it is helpful to draw the focus away from the importance of scientific evidence and fact. Much of the efforts to this end seek to emphasize the otherness of the expert, the fact that experts are exceptional, as if that were somehow a bad thing, instead of acknowledging that experts are drawn to their respective fields by passion and years of dedication, and that is okay. This tactic involves arousing suspicion of anyone with an exceptional interest in or aptitude for a given subject. How many times have you heard someone express disapproval of a particular candidate or expert because they, quote, didn't look like the type of person they'd want to sit down and have a beer with, end quote. So many people have become so overly focused on themselves and their own immediate needs that they can only imagine others like them in positions of expertise or power, if they even have a sense of the need for expertise at all. Disinformation is an essential tool in this regard. Indeed, in addition to discrediting expertise, the promotion of competing theories or explanations whose persistence is entirely attributable to the simple fact that they have never been disproven, rather than legitimate causal relationships supported by rigorous science, compiled and tested over decades by qualified peer-reviewed parties, has also become a legitimate 21st century problem. While the digital revolution has done much to promote the free flow of ideas and resources across the world, the same properties that make these rapidly evolving technologies so accessible also contribute to their ease in weaponization. The rapid-fire proliferation of social media platforms, media manipulation, deep fake capabilities, and global digital connectivity not only make it easier for parties with a vested interest in climate change denial to generate propaganda to suit their aims, they also make it instantly accessible worldwide. Disinformation has not only become more difficult to distinguish from actual fact-based information, it has also become more easily and rapidly disseminated across the globe. The ability to seed doubt in the minds of millions with the touch of a button has aided in undermining faith in the public institutions responsible for protecting people and the environment from threats such as climate change. Individual instances quickly become lost in the deluge of produced content and are almost immaterial. What matters is that these tools have enabled disinformation to cast doubt, not just on produced content, but on the processes at work inside these institutions as well.
That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. For more information on topics like this, you can follow all of MEI's coverage of climate and water on our website at www.mei.edu. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And you can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletter for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Mohammed Mahmoud. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.